It's getting to that time of the year where there's not a ton of new stuff coming out, so I do get a little bit lost for content ideas, but I was looking at the channel and I realized we hadn't actually made the top 5 best-selling rackets of the year yet. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. First of all, welcome to the new studio. We've had this gray paper background since pretty much the first video I made on this channel, and we finally decided it was time for a change. Hopefully you guys like it. Let me know what you think in the comment section. Now, it's great news that we haven't actually made this top 5 video yet, because generally people seem to like it a lot, and I get it. Rackets selling really well is generally a great indicator that they're, well, good rackets. I also want to say, of course, that just because a racket isn't on here, or if a racket doesn't sell well at all, that doesn't mean it's a bad racket by any stretch of the imagination. So if your racket isn't on this list, don't worry. Now, before we go on, I do just want to remind you that any of the rackets I talk about here today, you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. Now, I do just want to set out a few criteria in case there's any confusion. As usual, I'm only talking about the rackets that we carry at the store, and for this list, that makes a lot of sense because I'm actually looking at our sales numbers. I'm not just making these numbers up. The next thing is that I'm only counting current racket models. So for example, the Radical came out in March, which means we sold a few of the old ones in January and February. I'm not counting those old sales in this current list. That's it for the criteria. It's pretty simple, but I do quickly want to talk about some of the themes that I found with all of these rackets. Honestly, it lines up pretty well with what it's been for the past 2 years. One, these rackets are generally quite user-friendly and well-rounded so that they can work for a lot of people. And two, there's nothing too niche here. Thin-beamed 1820s, for example. I love them. I know there are a few other people out there like me that also love them, but they just don't sell all that well. I look at the Gravity Pro sales and I'm like, wow, despite all of my propaganda, it's really not doing all that hot. And you know what? It makes sense. Thin-beamed 1820s have some very specific playability. So it's stuff like that, things that make a racket more difficult to use, but also a bit more niche, where yes, it might work perfectly for a certain play style, but that playability also makes it more difficult to mesh with quickly for the average person. Hopefully that makes sense. I'll never stop pushing the Gravity Pro though. Don't worry, that's my hill to die on. But anyways, now let's get into number 5. So coming in at number 5, it's one of only 2 rackets that have been on this list each of the last 3 years. It's the Babolat Pure Aero 100, and credit to this racket. It came out in 2022, which is almost 3 years ago, and it's still in the top 5, which is really impressive. But to be fair, that is kind of par for the course with Babolat's flagship 100s. No spoilers. It doesn't really matter when they come out. They're such good rackets that people don't really care if they're flashy or new. They just know they're getting something good. Now here's the interesting thing with this racket. Usually, Babolat makes really subtle changes from one generation to the next, and they do that so that players don't feel a huge change in playability if they want to make the switch. This time though, they actually did change it quite a bit. They basically made it much more controlled than the last couple of Aeros. They made the string pattern quite a bit denser, they reverted back to more standard grommets compared to the really open spin grommets they had on the previous 2, and they also added flak inserts to make it feel a bit softer. This was a change that I instantly really appreciated, but I know some Pure Aero purists weren't the biggest fans of. The Aero had been such an all-out spin racket for basically 10 years that making it more well-rounded wasn't necessarily their cup of tea. But you know what? The most important metric for a racket's success is its sales, and I actually think the fact that it has sold so well, that it continues to sell so well even 3 years after it released, is proof that Babolat probably made the right choice with this change. There are very few rackets nowadays that are pure spin monsters like those older Aeros. Spin is still great to have in a racket, don't get me wrong, but not if it comes at the expense of other characteristics like control. So slightly less spin for much more control was definitely a leap of faith from Babolat, but the reality is this still swings like an Aero, it still feels like an Aero, and more stability, more control, a more consistent string bed definitely did improve it overall. The game has become quite a bit more varied in recent years, where grinding spin from the baseline is good, but you also want to be able to hit bigger shots, you want good touch up at the net, and that's exactly what this update does. It gives it better variety. Kudos to you, Babolat. You always seem to get it right. Now just do it to the Pure Strike. You've got an all-time great mold on your hands. You just got to do a little something extra to make it perfect, but I have full confidence that you will one day. Moving on to number 4. Yes, this is still a Pure Aero. No, it's not the same racket. It's the Babolat Pure Aero 98. Now this is probably the racket I've talked about most on this channel since I first started making videos, so it's not like I've got a ton of new original stuff to say, but I'm so happy it's on this list. I also have to say, I think part of the reason the Aero 100 isn't quite as popular as it once was is because of the Aero 98. One, because they share similar playability, so now there's a reason to go for the 98 over the 100, and two, endorsements. We'll get into playability in a second, but I think right now is the perfect time to explain why having the right player endorsing your racket can be pivotal in terms of how well it sells. Two of the most popular rackets of the 2000s and 2010s were the Aero Pro Drive and the Pro Staff. And yes, those rackets were great, don't get me wrong, but they also happen to have two of the most popular tennis figures of all time showing them off week in, week out. As sad as it is that Federer and Nadal aren't around anymore, there's an equally electrifying guy on tour now, Carlos Alcaraz. He's famously using the Aero 98, and very, very well for that matter. He pretty much makes the final of every tournament nowadays, and I really hope that doesn't jinx him. But that basically means that the Aero 98 is always fresh in people's minds when it's time to buy a new racket, and that has definitely helped in terms of sales. But now let's talk playability, because there is a reason why him and so many other pros are using it. The whole idea behind the Aero 98 is to blend the spin DNA of the Aero with a more stable and controlled response of a 98 square inch player's racket, and it's really quite phenomenal at doing that. The spin is obviously great. It's got much more than your average 98, but that's not too surprising. It's an Aero at the end of the day. The real shocking thing here is just how stable and precise it is. It's only 305 grams and it has a low 320 swing weight, but it's rock solid on contact. And despite having a pretty open string bed, it's basically a laser. Even on flat shots, it's remarkably consistent. Just look at Alcaraz. He's one of the best returners we've ever seen, and he plays with this racket pretty much in stock form. Returning ATP serves with a 305 to 310 gram racket is absolutely insane, but it's stable enough for that. And then you've got the rest of his game, which is variety and big shot making. He doesn't just like to sit back and grind from the baseline, he attacks and likes to flatten it out, and the racket responds very well to that style of play. So it's really no surprise that this racket's taken the tennis world by storm. It's got the right guy endorsing it, and its playability and variety is fantastic. Now, do I think it'll ever be the most popular racket on the market? No. The one thing that players really need to understand if they want to switch to the Aero 98 is that it's not that easy to swing. It has a big sweet spot for a 98, but it's still more punishing than most 100s, and it's also not an easy racket to bring through contact. It's got a lot of mass in the upper hoop, which is why it's so stable and powerful, but that makes it harder to swing. To be top 2 on this list, you gotta be easy to use for as many people as possible. So while I do think this will probably become the most popular advanced player's racket, I don't think it's ever going to be number 1, and to be honest, I don't think it should. Now we're finally moving on from the Aeros, and the next racket for me is the biggest surprise on this list, because it was number 1 2 years ago, then last year it was number 2, and then it got an update this year, and by my logic, that new racket buzz should have brought it right back up to number 1, but it's not. Coming in at number 3, we have the Babolat Pure Drive. Now, if we were to make this a top 5 best-selling rackets of the last 15 years, not just 2025, it would be number 1 and it wouldn't even be close. That's why I'm a little surprised it's not higher, but before I get into why that might be, let me first talk about how great it is and why it'll probably never slip out of the top 3. For me, the Pure Drive strikes the best balance of user-friendliness and top-end playability. The conventional school of thought has always been that the more user-friendly a racket is, the bigger its sweet spot, the more easy power it generates, the less stable it is, the less consistent it is, and it doesn't respond very well to fast technique. That's just not the case with this racket. It is super consistent. It's not a control racket, but the ball just never goes flying on you, and it's also very rewarding. The better you play, the better it responds. When you compare it to other powerful user-friendly rackets like the Ultra 100, the Clash 100, the Boom MP, those are not nearly as rewarding. They're similarly easy to use, but they don't respond nearly as well to advanced technique. That's why the Pure Drive attracts the very best players, but also people who are still learning, those more beginner and intermediate players, and that was the cornerstone for its number 1 spot for so long. Now, having thought about it a little more, I do understand why it's maybe not quite as popular as it once was. Nowadays, there are a lot of rackets that are very accessible to a wide range of player levels. You think of rackets like the Ezone 98, the Ezone 100, the Blade 100, the Speed MP. Those are all rackets that are very user-friendly, but also totally usable at a high level. So you've just got a few more choices in that style of racket now. There's also the fact that yes, a new Pure Drive came out this year, but it was a really subtle update. They softened it up a tiny bit and put a new dampening material in the layup, but it plays very similarly to the previous one. I think that's a good thing in the long run. This is a near perfect take on this style of racket, so they really didn't have to change it too much. But it also means there's less to get excited about to buy a new one right when it comes out. But it's also not like this racket is far behind number 2. It was a difference of like less than 10 rackets, so that could definitely change by the end of the year. So no, the Pure Drive is certainly not in crisis, but it is always a little bit surprising to me when it's not number 1. Coming in at number 2, we have a very interesting racket, and I actually made a video comparing this racket to the Pure Drive 100 because it is its closest competitor. It's the new Yonex Ezone 100. If you watched that video, you'll know I wasn't the biggest fan of this update, but that's more because it has changed quite a bit compared to the previous one, which was one of my favorite rackets. The major updates were that they made it softer with more stabilization technology, and they also changed the shape a little bit. They squared off the top of the hoop to bring the sweet spot farther up. What that does is that it makes it more powerful and spin friendly because you have more leverage over the ball, and it's also more comfortable with a bigger sweet spot, which makes the racket more forgiving. Now, I totally understand why it's been so well received. It kind of goes back to what I was saying about the Pure Drive and how it can work for so many players at different levels. It's more forgiving than the previous Ezone, and it's actually a bit more forgiving than the Pure Drive, especially for comfort. The downside to these changes is control, and that was my main issue. I found it a little bit launchy and slightly mushy. With that said, I do think I need to spend a little bit more time on court with it because I've heard from a lot of people that they don't actually think that's a problem here. I did test it with Yonex Polytour Pro, which is one of the softest and mushiest strings on the market, so maybe if I tried it with something a bit more responsive, that would sort out my problems with it. Moral of the story is I'm probably a little bit in the wrong here because it has been so popular. I talked to some of the stringers at the store who send it out for demo all the time, and generally people love it. The reality is it's a super solid racket that has some of the best variety out there. It's Yonex's power racket, but it also pretty much doubles down as a full-on spin racket as well. It has a fairly open string pattern, and it's got that aerodynamic throat similar to the Pure Aero, which makes it accelerate really quickly through contact when you swing with that windshield wiper motion. They also updated the layup, which makes it pocket the ball a little bit deeper, especially on spin shots, which I've actually really come to appreciate on the Ezone 98, so I'm sure a bit more time with the 100, and I'd probably feel the same way. That's also the biggest difference between the Ezone and the Pure Drive, by the way. You can obviously generate spin with the Pure Drive 100, but it's definitely not a spin racket. You get a lot more easy spin on the Ezone 100. Now let's move on to number 1. It was number 1 last year. It's still the best-selling racket this year. It's the Head Speed MP. And I know the new Legend just came out, so it's not technically a current racket, but I'm still including it here because it has been so dominant this year in terms of sales. When you combine the sales of both the Legend MP and the Speed MP, which are identical rackets other than the paint job, they have blown everyone else out of the water this year. Now, small caveat, sales are a bit inflated because we had the Legend on sale for a few months, but even without that, it would still be number 1. Now, why is that? Well, that's because the Speed MP is the ultimate well-rounded racket, and when they first released this design back in the 2010s, that's how they marketed it, which I thought was slightly questionable. That's not as enticing as big power, big spin, or even big control, so it wasn't an instant bestseller, but over time, people have realized that being excellent at everything is actually pretty important to playing good tennis. My favorite characteristic with the Speed MP is its combination of big hitting potential with consistency. It has a constant beam, which gives it that control and somewhat classic flex, but it's pretty thick at 23 millimeters. That's what makes it more rigid and more powerful than something with a super thin beam, like, say, I don't know, a Gravity Pro or something. And it's obviously not as controlled as a racket like that, but it's so much more powerful. Its power is almost up there with rackets like the Ezone and the Pure Drive. Then it's also got really good spin. Again, not quite as much as something like the Aero 100 or the Extreme MP, but it's that combination of all three, power, spin, and control, that makes it so well-rounded. But possibly the biggest reason for its success, especially in recent years, is that Head actually tweaked the design a little bit a few years back. They thickened the beam from 22 millimeters to 23. That makes it significantly more forgiving. I know it doesn't sound like a huge change, but it actually makes the sweet spot much bigger and the racket more resilient on off-center shots. There are some downsides with that. I've already talked about that in plenty of other videos. I'm not going to repeat myself here, but the reality is it's a change that has really paid dividends for Head, especially in making it more accessible, again, to a wider variety of player types. And then you've got this guy and this guy. One endorses the regular Speed MP, although he still uses the old paint job for some reason, and the other one endorses the Legend. Technically the Pro, but it's still a Speed, so Head has pretty much perfectly optimized the endorsements for this frame. It goes back to what I was saying about the Aero 98, having the right people endorsing it, can't stress how important that is. But yeah, the Head Speed MP takes the #1 spot for the best-selling racket at Rackets and Runners for the 2nd year running. I'm not gonna lie, I am a big fan of Head rackets, so it does make me pretty happy to see them having the success they deserve, especially because they did go through a pretty rough patch a few years back. Now they've got a super solid lineup, and the Speed is their golden goose, which they really needed, especially considering how dominant some of the other brands were for a very long time. Now, quick word on the Legend, it's actually pretty different to the old one, not in terms of design, but in terms of how it feels on contact. You can check out my review of the Legend MP if you want to know a little more, but I think that one might be even more successful than the last one. It's a really solid update, and I actually think it's an improvement overall. But that's it for the top 5 this year. I always love making this list. Obviously, I've got my personal racket preferences, but it's always nice to know what most people like, because that's a good indicator of where the industry is and probably also where it's going. With that said, that is going to be the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to demo any of these rackets, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.